When we analyze the rhetoric of a text, we are examining what a writer does to achieve their purpose and why they do it this way. We're essentially looking for the different rhetorical choices that a writer makes. A rhetorical choice is just anything a writer does in a text to persuade. We sometimes call these rhetorical strategies, but essentially they're any rhetorical means to a rhetorical end. By means, I mean something that is done. So a rhetorical means would be something that is done to persuade. And by end, I just mean something that is achieved. So a rhetorical end would be some persuasive effect that is achieved on the audience. To learn how to identify rhetorical choices in a text, you must first understand the different means of persuasion. That is, the elements that all writers draw from to make their ideas persuasive. Back in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle characterized 3 different means whereby persuasion is achieved. He said that persuasion could be achieved through the reasonableness of the text, through the character of the writer, and through the emotional disposition of the audience. Not much has changed since Aristotle wrote that, except that we now call these 3 means of persuasion the 3 appeals, or the 3 rhetorical appeals, and they often go by these common terms: logos, which is persuasion through the reasonableness of the text; ethos, which is persuasion through the character of the writer; and pathos, which is persuasion through the emotional disposition of the audience. Warning: the terms logos, ethos, and pathos are banned from your writing in this class. The reason for this is that inexperienced writers often use these terms in place of detailed explanation, which leaves their analyses vague and ambiguous. And oftentimes, other inexperienced writers have actually learned the wrong meanings of these terms, and so we're just going to ban them outright in your writing. We will still use them to talk about techniques, but when you sit down to write an analysis, you may not use the terms logos, ethos, or pathos. Instead, you should discuss how a particular idea in a text persuades through arguing some logical reasoning, through characterizing the writer in some fashion, or through stirring some specific emotion in the audience. Let's look at some examples of the 3 means of persuasion in use, and we'll look at the text of Patrick Henry's speech to the Second Virginia Convention. In paragraph 3, Henry uses a series of rhetorical questions, and these questions help him argue that the buildup of British military forces is a sign that King George intends to pacify the colonies through violence. No indication that the king will finally accept their petitions for redress, and so therefore no hope that the conflict can end peacefully. This is an example of persuading through reason. Henry is making a causal argument here. He uses the rhetorical questioning to lead his audience to his conclusion, but essentially he's just arguing this idea. Before we move on, let's do a quick write over persuading through logic and reason. Logic and reason are persuasive just because they make ideas make sense. Our minds crave order. We want things to make sense. And we want that so much that sometimes we're willing to twist logic to fit our biases. So logic and reason are very, very persuasive. Let's move on to another example from Henry's speech. In paragraph 1, Henry uses apologia, which is a sort of rhetorical apology. He says that he must share his opinions, no matter how offensive they may be to some in the audience, because if he doesn't do so, he would be betraying his own country. This is an example of persuading through character. Henry is making himself appear virtuous. Specifically, he's making himself appear selfless, as someone who is willing to be unpopular if it means saving the nation, if it means saving something that's more important than himself. Before we move on, let's do another quick write, this one over persuading through character. The reason why a writer's character can be persuasive is because we tend to go along with ideas from a trusted source. It saves us the time of having to reason every single thing out for ourselves, so we tend to go along with certain kinds of people. Once again, sometimes we do this so much we have a tendency to blindly follow certain people without thinking, and that's how demagogues are created. Let's look at one final rhetorical choice that Henry makes. In paragraph 4, he questions the delegates' resolve by asking whether they will sit still while the British take everything, asking whether they intend to hold on to, quote, the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot. Yeah, these evocative words are designed to persuade through emotion. Henry is attempting to stir outrage at the British, at the thought of not doing anything to fight against them. You could also say he's stirring a little shame towards those in the audience who seem willing to just sit idly by and do nothing. Let's do one last quick write, this one over persuasion through emotion. Emotions can be persuasive because we are emotional creatures. We tend to go along with certain ideas when we are placed in certain frames of mind. Again, sometimes to the point that we can be manipulated into doing things when our emotions are stirred. Skilled writers will use a blend of all three means of persuasion in a text. However, the rhetorical situation will dictate how these three means are used, and some situations may require the use of one more than the others.